Hello and welcome to Good Drugs. I'm Michael Fiedler, PhD, and I'm of the belief that in order to get through this thing called life, we need potions, elixirs, magic pills, and it's just a matter of finding good ones. And the good drug today is Hemlibra, which is, or otherwise known as emicizumab, and it's used for the treatment of hemophilia A. This drug is made by Roche Genentech, and it's a fantastic molecule. It's what's known as a bispecific antibody. That means that it is an antibody that can bind to two different entities or proteins, and it's used for the treatment of hemophilia A. So let's talk a little bit about hemophilia A itself. So hemophilia, as most people I'm sure can appreciate, is a bleeding disorder. What happens in what's called the clotting cascade in response to a bleed is you have a series of factors that interact with each other like dominoes, and where one knocks over another, knocks over another, knocks over another, that ultimately leads to the formation of a clot. And you have a lot of clotting factors. You have factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, factor 4, etc. And they interact in a sort of this cascade of events that ultimately leads to the formation of a clot. And in hemophilia, you're missing a clotting factor. For hemophilia A, you're missing clotting factor 8. And for hemophilia B, you're missing clotting factor 9. So that's essentially what hemophilia is. And it's relatively rare. There's about 20,000 people in the U.S. That have hemophilia A. And it's pretty well controlled now. Historically, the way you treated hemophilia was you gave people blood transfusions, and the blood transfusion was useful to sort of replace the blood, but also mainly to just give them factor 8 because that's what they don't have, and that sort of allows the patient to have the ability to form a blood clot. And one of the things that was limiting about that is the fact that during the 70s and 80s, you had an HIV epidemic, and people were donating blood without knowing that they were HIV positive, and so you had the hemophilia community was devastated with AIDS because people were sort of getting blood transfusions, not realizing that they had this virus in it. So that really created this close-knit community of hemophilia patients, which was really intense, and essentially continues to be, although maybe not to the same extent. But it was a really very self-contained disease space because this tight-knit group had been devastated by the HIV epidemic and as well as the hepatitis C. Because they were relying on blood products they didn't know were infected. And so it's a really sort of just tight-knit group, and that's about, I can't really do it justice, but that's sort of, just take my word for it. And fortunately, the treatment modalities for hemophilia have really evolved over the last 40 years. With the advent of good recombinant DNA technologies, companies have been able to create artificial factor 8, kind of like insulin that you can give to patients. And factor products have been around for quite a while now. And they're good. They essentially replace the function that factor 8 is missing, but they have limitations. And by that, I mean that in order to get a factor product, you have to infuse it. And infusions are tricky. I'm not talking about a pill, and I'm not talking about an injection that you can sort of stick in your belly. I'm talking about having to hook yourself up to a drip and what's called an IV port to kind of get it infused in your body. So that's a little more cumbersome. And factor products don't last very long. They, their half-life is on the order of hours or days. So you have to have these infusions frequently. So people with hemophilia have to have infusions, every 2-3 days, which is, not only burdensome for the person, but it's also, and their caretaker, because these patients are oftentimes young boys. But it's also really expensive. And you're talking about having to give somebody an infusion every couple of days. And that's a lot to ask. And so the Hemlibra is a really revolutionary drug. It's a fantastic molecule, and I feel privileged to have supported it because it really blew up the hemophilia space. There's been an assortment of innovations over the last 10 years in hemophilia, because various pharmaceutical companies have tried to extend the half-life of factor products. And what they do is they bolt on moieties, or which is a sophisticated word of just saying, additional functional elements to the factor VIII protein that allows it to remain in your bloodstream for longer. So they can add what's called pegylation, which makes the molecule larger and harder to clear. They can add fragments of an antibody that allow it to stick around longer. So there's been this innovation to improve factor products, but Hemlibra really came in and revolutionized it all in a way that nothing else had done. And I think there are something like 40 blood factor products, and Hemlibra leapfrogged them all. And I'll sort of explain why that's the case, but I'll first talk a little bit about like how Hemlibra itself works. So as I mentioned, it is a bispecific antibody, which means that if you imagine an antibody molecule in your mind is sort of shaped like a Y, normally the antibody would allow things to sort of rest in that think of it like a chalice, like that's where the molecule can bind in that opening of the Y. But with a bispecific antibody, you have a left and a right arm that bind two different things. So instead of binding one thing, you're binding to two things. That's why it's called a bispecific antibody. And the two things that Hemlibra binds to are factor IX and factor X. And the reason why that's relevant is that normally in our bodies, factor VIII brings together factor IX and factor X to catalyze the clotting cascade to allow for the formation of a clot. That's essentially like how the protein works. And what Hemlibra does is executes that exact same feat, but just not the way factor VIII does it. It just does it through this bispecific antibody. So it's factor VIII. It's sort of playing the role of factor VIII without being factor VIII. And before I forget, I'll have materials in the comment section to kind of give you a little more background about how this all works, as it is quite complicated. And the ability for Hemlibra to do this was really disruptive in the space. And the reason why that is that there is hemophilia, which is, this rare disease, and it's a bleeding disorder, and it's cumbersome to get these infusions and such. But the advent of factor products has made the disease quite manageable. There is sort of risk of patients feeling like they're cured and overexerting themselves and, playing tackle football. But for all intents and purposes, you can replace the product that you're missing, and people can have essentially a normal life and what's called prophylaxis, where you get regular infusions of product. But there's another demographic within the hemophilia community, an even smaller group, what are called hemophilia patients with inhibitors. And what that means is, for whatever reason, your body generates an immune response against factor VIII. So even if you can infuse the product, your body will reject it. And these patients are in deep trouble, because we know what's wrong with them. They're missing factor VIII, and we want to give them factor VIII, but their body rejects it. And that's unfortunate, because these patients now cannot reap the benefits of treatments the way regular hemophilia patients would, and they're essentially screwed. And this is a subset of hemophilia patients, and it's probably, it depends on what numbers you look at, but they say that's maybe like a third of hemophilia patients will form inhibitors, but there's degrees of inhibitors. So it's if there's 20,000 hemophilia patients out there in the US, there might be 1,000 or 2,000 ones that actually have like really problematic inhibitors. So it's a really, really small group. But because Hemlibra functions in the same capacity as factor VIII without itself being factor VIII, it can facilitate the clotting cascade, even in the presence of inhibitors. And so, because it doesn't look like factor VIII, the body doesn't generate an immune response to it the way it does to factor VIII. So where Hemlibra really blew the doors off the hemophilia community was efficacy in this disease segment, hemophilia A, with inhibitors. And historically, hemophilia A patients with inhibitors didn't have the same kind of treatment options that regular hemophilia did. They, as I mentioned, the factor VIII products just straight up don't work because of the formation of inhibitors. And so what you can get are what are called bypassing agents. And bypassing agents sort of shortcut the clotting cascade to allow you to form some degree of a clot, but they're really expensive, and they don't do a great job. They're okay, but they don't function as fluidly as a factor VIII product would. And so hemophilia A patients with inhibitors are one of the most expensive and poorly controlled diseases out there. So for an ability for a molecule like Hemlibra to come in and execute this, sort of like fill in this gap, this clotting gap that that factor VIII would have filled, even in the presence of inhibitors, really blew people's minds, because not only are you accomplishing the feat that you're facilitating this clotting cascade in patients that don't have factor VIII, but you can do it even in the presence of inhibitors. And nothing before had been able to have that capability. So Hemlibra, it has been a very disruptive molecule in the hemophilia space. And when I say disruptive, that is disruptive for both good and bad reasons. And so, as I mentioned, one of the things that made this really disruptive was the fact that hemophilia A patients with inhibitors could benefit from this treatment, and they had kind of been left for dead. There weren't treatment options available. But there are sort of challenges with this disruption as well. And so I'll kind of give sort of like pros and cons with Hemlibra, so it sort of give you a balanced view of the drug, even though ultimately it's a very awesome and good drug. But one of the hangups with this disruptive molecule is that it interferes with biochemical assays to monitor patients with hemophilia. So a huge part of the hemophilia sort of like treatment experience is patients pay very close attention to what their factor VIII levels are, how well their body has an ability to form a blood clot. And so regular monitoring of patients' blood levels is something that happens on a regular basis, so that patients can feel comfortable if they want to go skiing, or if they want to play a sport, or they're going to go traveling. Like, they want to make sure that their motor is running just fine. And so they pay very close attention to how things are functioning, and blood tests and labs are very important in the hemophilia space. And Hemlibra screws them all up. Because the molecule functions very differently, the entities within these various clotting assays do all kinds of funky things. They show super clotting activity, or they show no clotting activity. And the best way that I can articulate that is, imagine if you were trying to explain Wi-Fi to somebody who had only ever used a touch-tone phone. There's just, Hemlibra functions in a way that assays don't know how to interpret. And so Genentech and Roche have done a lot of work to try to overcome this, and they've created like Hemlibra friendly assays. But that was sort of something that was a big deal once the drug first became available, because these regular normal monitoring approaches no longer applied, because Hemlibra was this totally different entity that these assays sort of weren't compatible with. So that's sort of like a knock on Hemlibra in terms of disruption. Going back to the pros, another hugely disruptive element about Hemlibra is the fact that it is so insanely convenient. As I mentioned, infusions are a pain in the butt, and most factor products have to be infused, because factor VIII is not a particularly long-lasting molecule. You got to put it right into the bloodstream for it to do its job, and you got to do it, twice a week, 3 times a week. Whereas because Hemlibra is an antibody, it has a much longer half-life, and you don't have to give it intravenously. You can give it through a subcutaneous injection, like you would insulin, sort of in your belly fat. And so Hemlibra is, not only do you not have to get an infusion, but the frequency is also much lower. And depending on your body weight, and depending on how much coverage you need, you can take Hemlibra as frequently as once a week, but you can also take it as infrequently as once a month. And so you're talking about shaving off 3/4 of your touch points, because you no longer have to have all these frequent infusions. So not only is it a subcutaneous injection, which is easier, but it's an infrequent subcutaneous injection. So that bang has made Hemlibra really disruptive in terms of its ability to free patients from having to be confined to their various treatment regimens, which are quite labor intensive. So switching back over to a negative thing that Hemlibra does in terms of disruption is, it not only does it mess with clotting assays and cause sort of that disruption there. But it also can interfere with agents that are used to treat what are called breakthrough bleeds. So I mentioned hemophilia A patients with inhibitors get treated with these things called bypassing agents, which are used as sort of like a MacGyver solution to the inhibitor problem. It's not great, but it kind of does its job, sort of. But these bypassing agents can also be used for what are called breakthrough bleeds. So let's say a patient gets in a car accident, and even though they have factor VIII or Hemlibra in their system, they may still need additional factor therapy to kind of further protect them in response to a breakthrough bleeding episode. And so a lot of bypassing agents can be used with hemophilia, with Hemlibra, but there's one in particular that should not be, and that's called FIBA, which is FEIBA. And FIBA is a mixture of proteins to sort of overcome the limitations of your body and to kind of I think it's a mixture of like factor VII and various tissue factors, and it's quite a mixture in FIBA. And what they didn't appreciate when they were investigating Hemlibra is that if you use FIBA in response to a breakthrough bleed, sort of a traumatic situation, or for whatever reason that you get an event that Hemlibra can't cover up, and you add this FIBA agent, what you get is, in the presence of both Hemlibra and FIBA, you get this hyper thrombotic activity, which means that Hemlibra catalyzes an activity too well, and you form a thrombotic event, or like a blood clot. And they actually had patients die because of this. So Hemlibra is so good at doing this that if you add in additional substrate in the form of this FIBA breakthrough bleed agent, you can actually get a hyper thrombosis, and you get a clotting activity, which killed a few people. So that's kind of a complication with Hemlibra that is a big deal, because there's had to be so much education on, you can use Hemlibra and it's a great drug, but don't use it in conjunction with some of these other entities, because you can have the risk of these hyperthrombotic events. So that's a negative disruptor. Going back to the positive disruptor, one of the things that Genentech did that was really, I don't want to say aggressive, but it was very, bold, was they priced Hemlibra quite low. And, as a molecule that was going to change the life of hemophilia A patients with inhibitors, something that no other drug could do, they could have charged quite a bit for it if they chose to, but they opted not to do that. And they priced Hemlibra either at sort of like market value for existing products or even lower. So not only did you have this groundbreaking sort of like total breakthrough therapy that was going to sort of like cure patients that didn't have the treatments that they need, but it was also cheap, or cheaper. And that was really good for the patients out there, because you had really efficient access to the drug because it was relatively inexpensive. And that was what sort of the last nail in the coffin of what allowed Hemlibra to sort of leapfrog all of these other blood products. So not only was it innovative, but it was cheap. But that has its own consequences. And so in so doing, there are a lot of people in the pharma space who are not huge fans of Hemlibra because they but they absorbed a lot of market share very quickly. And so not only do you have, the patients are the winners in that situation, but a lot of companies that make factor products were not overly thrilled about Hemlibra taking all of these patients. And one company called Shire, who makes FIBA, is really not a big fan of Hemlibra, and there's quite a litigious relationship between Genentech and Shire, and that was a very messy drama that happened right around Hemlibra's launch. So while it's a fantastic drug, it does have this disruptive entity that had this cascade, not to use a pun, of consequences that really blew up this hemophilia space in a way that it will never be the same again. And there are the next sort of round of innovation in hemophilia is going to be gene therapy, which is showing up in a whole host of different areas. But even gene therapy is likely not going to have the effect on the hemophilia space that Hemlibra has, because not everybody is going to be a candidate for gene therapy. If you can still form inhibitors even with the presence of gene therapy. So Hemlibra, it is a milestone that is not likely to be matched anytime soon. It really has been, in 20 years, we'll look back on how Hemlibra, there was the hemophilia space before Hemlibra, and there was the hemophilia space after Hemlibra, in a good way. It has really revolutionized the way that this disease is treated, and has activated a patient population in the hemophilia A patients with inhibitors that had no life before this drug, and now they have a life where they can go swimming, or they can go play lacrosse, or they're activated in ways they weren't before. And to kind of put a cherry on top, not only has Hemlibra sort of revolutionized the hemophilia space, but it actually has been an extraordinary proof of principle about this whole concept of a bispecific antibody. And Genentech is doubling down on this concept and have created a sort of a whole platform that revolves around this bispecific revolution, where they're attempting to find new ways of using antibodies in this manner. And another antibody that is also being investigated that is also a bispecific is called faricimab, which they're investigating for diabetic retinopathy. And that's just another example, but there are more to follow. So it is really changed the way that people look at what options are considered for the way that certain conditions can be treated. And this bispecific nature is a really a whole new dimension of investigation, and it's not easy. It's not as simple as like, oh yeah, just create one half that binds to this and one half that binds to that. The company that initially just engineered emicizumab, or they called it ACE910, was called the company called Chugai. It's in Japan, and they have done fantastic antibody work, but it took like 10 years, and they had to screen like 40,000 candidates to get to emicizumab, so it didn't come easy. But medicine, both within the hemophilia space and outside, will never be the same in response to it, because we're now thinking about approaching diseases in a whole different way using a bispecific antibody. So it's a lot of dialogue on Hemlibra, but you can appreciate why I think it's a good drug. And it was a pleasure to support it in various ways. And hope you enjoyed this. And if you want to learn more about good drugs, feel free to subscribe. Take care. Be safe.